Elite Facts presents
5 misconceptions about the medieval era that will shock you.
5.
The death penalty was common in the Middle Ages. Off with their heads? You'd think that would be something you'd hear quite often during this time period. Well, as it turns out, we have completely blown the death penalty way out of proportion when talking about the Middle Ages. Despite what many people believe, the Middle Ages gave birth to the jury system, and trials were in fact very fair. The death penalty back then was considered to be extremely severe and was used only in the worst cases of crimes like murder, treason, and arson. It was not until the Middle Ages began to draw to a close that people like Elizabeth I began to use the death penalty as a means to rid their nations of religious opponents. Public beheadings were not as we see in the movies. Not just any person could go to one of these public beheadings, as they were a quote-unquote luxury exclusive to the elite. So people who were rich or had power, and were usually not performed in a public space. The most common method of execution was hanging, and burning was extremely rare, and usually performed after the criminal had been hanged to death first. 4. Hygiene was poor back then. Even if we know nothing else about the Middle Ages, we know that everyone was absolutely filthy. Medieval peasants looked like something straight out of Monty Python, and upper classes weren't any better for that matter, as their hygiene was only slightly above peasants of that era. Well, people back then took baths with about the same frequency as we go and get our cars checked at our local garage, maybe a couple of times a year. I wish I was that lucky. They were way into bathing for much of the Middle Ages, maybe too into it. They continued the Roman practice where a bunch of strangers got naked together for communal bathing, and most towns and even villages in medieval Germany had a communal bath where craftsmen would hang out and bathe together after a hard day's work. Yeah, totally not awkward or anything. Meanwhile, not only was it common for medieval folk to wash their hands before and after eating, it was also customary to offer to bathe with guests when they entered your home, something the man has repeatedly reminded us is no longer acceptable in modern society. I mean, could you seriously imagine that in this day and age? Honey, the guy is here to check the gas and electric meters. I'm gonna ask him if he wants to take a bath with us. It just wouldn't work these days. Medieval demand for soap, usually made from animal fats with a variety of oils and salts added, was so great that by the 13th century, soap was being made on an almost industrial scale in Britain, Italy, Spain, and France. So why do we picture everyone as wallowing in their own filth back then? Well, things changed all at once. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death strolled up and kicked Europe right in the teeth with its pestilence boot. Suddenly, smart people were telling the previously washed masses that bathing was a surefire way to open your body's pores and invite in all the bad spirits or gremlins or flying spaghetti monsters. Well, those last two were a lie, but people back then would be gullible enough to believe something like that. Anyway, as a result, by the early modern period of history, bathing had become obsolete.
3.
Starvation was a serious problem. If you change starvation to a little bit peckish, then yes, that would be true. However, this is completely false. Peasants, those who worked in manual labor, would have had fresh porridge and bread daily with beer to drink. Personally speaking, that's not a bad deal at all. In addition, each day would have an assortment of dried or cured meats, cheeses, and fruits and vegetables from their area. If anything, people back then were stuffed rather than starving. Sure, the quality of food may have been poor in comparison to that of what the elite were feasting on. However, they didn't exactly have it that bad in terms of food. They would feast on poultry, chicken, ducks, pigeons, and geese were not uncommon on the peasants' dinner table. Some peasants also liked to keep bees to provide honey for their tables. The rich of the time, by comparison, had a great choice of meats, such as cattle and sheep. They would eat more courses for each meal than the poor, and would probably have had a number of spiced dishes, something the poor could not afford.
2.
Knights were honorable, chivalrous warriors. Knights have been portrayed by the media to be gallant and brave warriors, charging into battle to slay the dragon and rescue the fair maiden. The reality of the situation, however, is that knights often had less in common with this and could be more accurately compared to barbarians. Keep in mind that knights were professional warriors, and when there wasn't a war to fight, they had to find something to do to serve their bloodlust. Most of these guys were relatively young and didn't have any violent games to satisfy their violent urges, so they tended to take it out on the local population. That's right, instead of training to keep their skills and wits ready for another battle, they instead turned their attention to the local population. Toward the 11th century, many of the local lords started bickering over who would get a slice of the Holy Roman pie that Charlemagne baked, and the knights were at the forefront of these petty wars. These wars were much less epic than something you'd expect out of, I don't know, a Lord of the Rings film, for example, and were instead more knights rolling up into villages and slaughtering everybody in sight. The church tried to curb these conflicts because, frankly, they were nasty and threatened the stability of, well, everything. First, they tried to gather up all the knights and shake various body parts of dead saints at them. But when that didn't work, the Pope called the First Crusade and exported all these scumbags to the Middle East, where they chivalrously ate babies and massacred the entire population of Jerusalem. Yeah, they were just awful. Later, attempts were made to get these youngins under control, one being the chivalric code that was adopted around the 13th century. Examples like Sir Lancelot and Edward the Black Prince were raised to show knights how to behave in battle and in peace. Knights were encouraged to defend the weak, but the weak was commonly interpreted as noble women and children, not peasants. So noble-on-noble violence may have decreased, but it was still totally cool for knights to kill and maim peasants.
1.
There was zero scientific progression during this time period. Let's be honest, the closest thing we think of when it comes to both science and the Middle Ages is those bloody potions that wizards made in Disney films. I mean, we do call this period the Dark Ages for a reason. Any scientist who dared to actually study the universe would be shut down by the Catholic Church, which thought anything scientific was downright immoral and that the Bible was all anybody ever really needed. I mean, again, we're talking about a time period that thought the world was flat. In come the comments saying that the world is flat. Aside from the fact that, as we've already explained, most people in the Middle Ages did not think the Earth was flat, the Church wasn't responsible for killing science. To the contrary, it was largely responsible for saving it. After the barbarians invaded Europe and Rome went the way of the dinosaurs, the Catholic Church was the last remaining aspect of Roman culture in Western Europe. The Church went about setting up monasteries across Europe, and along with the monks came the monks' massive libraries. Monks were just about the only educated people in the early Middle Ages, and pretty much everything we know about this entire time period was written by them. As time went on, the church decided that it was time to step it up a notch and decided to start establishing universities to foster the preservation of knowledge. The universities would include the likes of Oxford, Cambridge, and the University of Paris, not to mention pretty much every other top school in Europe. At these universities, students studied more than just college kids do today, with an average bachelor's degree taking up to 7 years to earn, and a master's or doctorate taking several more. These universities not only helped with advancements in science, and in some cases medicine, but also helped with translation, as they were able to translate the Latin language. The only thing that universities were lacking back then were fraternities, alcohol, and the green stuff that most campuses have these days. Around the same time as universities were popping up all over Europe, the Crusades were bringing Europeans into contact with advanced Muslim ideas of science and technology. Ideas like the compass and the astrolabe came to the West via Muslim Spain and came in handy during the later Age of Exploration. Italian merchants came back from trading in North Africa and gave us another innovation, Arabic numerals. Medicine also made massive advances thanks to the university system. Contrary to popular belief, dissection of corpses was actually fine and dandy with the church, and medieval universities often did it in their basement. Okay, maybe we're using the term fine and dandy loosely on this one if they're doing dissections in basements. So really, the Middle Ages was quite revolutionary when it came to scientific and medical advancements and education. Any other misconceptions worth mentioning? Let us know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more Elite Facts.